Greetings. My name is Anya Fink, and I'm a research scientist in the Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analyses. In my role as the moderator, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event introducing a new report from the Nuclear Policy Program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace titled Reimagining Nuclear Arms Control, a Comprehensive Approach. This report comes at a challenging time for international security. The relations between the United States and Russia and the United States and China are marred with political military tensions and potentially structural hostilities. All three countries are pursuing modernization of their strategic capabilities, both nuclear and conventional. In addition, some in these countries argue that newly emerging technologies may change the character of war in the future, and thus foregoing or limited technological advances may render anyone left behind vulnerable. In this environment with unstable political, military, and technological dimensions, the United States and Russia have recently launched strategic stability talks, but even these long-awaited talks are now potentially at a risk of being undermined by the crisis around Ukraine. This report puts forward 9 practical measures between the United States, Russia, and China for reducing the risk of nuclear war. 6 of the 9 are near-term measures, and 3 are longer-term measures that include nuclear, conventional, missile defense, and space capabilities. The report puts forward a creative menu of trilateral and bilateral formats and lays out contours of formal arms control agreements, as well as transparency and confidence building measures between the 3 states. Our 2 speakers today are James Acton, who is the Jessica T. Matthews Chair and is co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment. A physicist by training, James is a leading expert on nuclear policy issues, including risks of escalation, entanglement, and hypersonic weapons. T.D. MacDonald is a fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment. He was most recently at MIT and has an interdisciplinary scientific background. T.D.'s current research focuses on the verification of nuclear arms control and non-proliferation agreements. I will now hand it over to James and T.D. for their remarks. Then we will discuss some of the aspects of the report in greater detail, and then we'll answer questions from you, the audience. We'll plan to conclude a little after the 1-hour mark. James?
Anya, thank you so much, and thank you so much for agreeing to moderate the discussion this morning. I want to start off by just acknowledging and thanking my co-authors on this project, TD, who is here, and Pranay, who rejoined the State Department back in May, but worked on this project for 1.5 years of its 2-year lifespan and made huge contributions. And also to Matt Harries, who contributed to our work on warhead verification. And I'd also like to acknowledge all the funders. There's too many to spell out here, but you can find all of those in the report, which is now live online, by the way. The background for this project, as I think Anya aptly described, is a series of growing nuclear risks. There is certainly qualitative arms racing between the United States and Russia, and between the United States and China. In some ways, that arms racing has already turned quantitative, and if what's left of the arms control architecture, in particular New START, degrades entirely, then we could be back in an era of full-blown quantitative arms racing. Perhaps even more concerningly from my perspective, if growing international tensions spill over into conflict, technological developments, I think, threaten escalation to the nuclear level in such a conflict, in particular because of real and perceived threats from both nuclear and non-nuclear weapons to nuclear forces, their command and control infrastructure, and leadership. Against this concerning background, the governments of the United States, Russia, and China all say that they support arms control as a way to moderate these risks. But they have very, very different opinions about what that kind of arms control should look like, and consequently haven't been able to identify a practical way forward. From the US, the goals for arms control that the United States has identified concentrate primarily on Russian and Chinese nuclear weapons. Russia's large and reportedly growing and modernizing force of non-strategic nuclear weapons, but also Russia's so-called exotic strategic capabilities, systems like its nuclear-powered torpedo, Poseidon, the nuclear-powered cruise missile, Burovetsnik. The United States has also expressed concerns about China's growing nuclear arsenal, its building of silos, the expansion of its strategic forces. And meanwhile, from the Russian and Chinese perspective, their arms control goals relate primarily to US non-nuclear capabilities. Russia and China are clearly worried about US ballistic missile defenses. They're worried about the potential impact of high-precision conventional weapons on the survivability of their nuclear forces. I think it goes without saying that US and Soviet arms control goals during the Cold War were in no way perfectly symmetrical, but I would argue that since the end of the Cold War, this asymmetry has got wider. So what we sought to do in this project was to try to identify a practical way forward on arms control. And we use arms control in its broad original sense, as coined by Schelling and Halperin, to mean all forms of military cooperation between potential adversaries. This certainly includes legally binding limits and reductions on forces, but it's a broader concept than that in our Schelling and Halperin's opinion. That also includes non-binding confidence and transparency building measures. And the new report that we put out today outlines 9 practical steps, as Anya's already mentioned, some legally binding, some politically binding, some short-term, some long-term. The first step, as we see it, is for the US and Russia to as they have just started to do, to re-engage on arms control discussions with the goal of negotiating a follow-on to New START. Pranay and I, about 15 months ago now, presented in a paper what we think the New START follow-on should look like. But our vision here is actually for a much narrower treaty than many others are calling for, one that focuses narrowly on strategic offensive arms. Now, that's a phrase that includes both nuclear and certain types of non-nuclear arms. But we think if you try to expand this too broadly to incorporate non-strategic nuclear weapons, then Russia puts ballistic missile defense on the table, and you quickly get bogged out. You turn an extremely difficult negotiation into an impossible negotiation. So a New START replacement, in our opinion, is not going to solve, it will solve some important or mitigate some important problems to do with strategic offensive arms, but it will leave a whole load of other issues untouched. And that's where this new report comes in. So firstly, in parallel to the negotiation of a New START follow-on, we propose a series of non-binding confidence building measures to start addressing the concerns that can't be managed within the framework of a New START follow-on. Those include issues like ballistic missile defense and non-strategic nuclear weapons. Historically, Russia has said that it's not really interested in non-legally binding arms control. That's actually changed recently. Russia's deputy foreign minister, Sergei Rybkov, has said actually explicitly at the Carnegie conference earlier this year, and in other fora too, that Russia is interested in negotiating agreements with different legal statuses, by which he means legally binding and non-binding agreements alongside one another. China is going to be altogether harder to engage, but we have measures there to do with fissile material, which has become a lot more important in the near term. And particularly trilateral measures to stop the growing competition between the United States, Russia, and China in space from spilling over into the nuclear domain. Now, there's 3 of those measures, and TD is going to talk in detail about 2 of those in just a sec. But one thing we think is critical here is going to be to package measures together to create win-win packages. You know, our proposal on ballistic missile defense, for example, which relates to or non-strategic nuclear weapons, that's a perfectly symmetric proposal. The US and Russia would have equal obligations. But non-strategic nuclear weapons is a much bigger concern for the US than for Russia. So even though the obligations under any given proposal may be symmetric, one party can view it as more of an advantage than the other. And we think one way to try to get around this is to negotiate packages of measures together. So the US and Russia agreed to do a measure on ballistic missile defense and a measure on non-strategic nuclear weapons at the same time, thereby creating this kind of win-win package. And then finally, the report contains some more challenging longer-term proposals, which I'm going to talk about at the very end of it. But I just kind of wanted to start by describing our overall approach here. And now to focus on how to prevent this competition in space from spilling over into the nuclear domain with all the consequences, let me turn over to TV briefly.
Great, thanks, James. So as James mentioned, I'm going to be talking about two of our proposals from the report that are they're in space, but they're looking at issues that really at the intersection of the space and nuclear domains. So the first proposal looks at the way to protect nuclear command and control satellites in high altitude orbits from anti-satellite weapons. And the second proposal looks at prohibition on the testing and deployment of space-based ballistic missile interceptors. So starting with the first proposal, the motivation behind it is that many of the satellites with roles sort of in nuclear command and control and early warning happen to inhabit high altitude orbits. So these are things like geostationary orbit, geosynchronous orbits, and some elliptical orbits like Molniya orbits. So being at these very high altitudes, and those 36,000 kilometers or 22,000 miles above the Earth, they're very difficult to attack with ground-based anti-satellite weapons. So you can think of say the Noodle system, which Russia recently tested, just because they're so far away. However, there are the type of anti-satellite weapons called co-orbital anti-satellite weapons, sometimes referred to as space mines. And these sort of get around this distance issue by having the anti-satellite weapon essentially live in orbit, in the same orbits as the targets. And then they can later be activated, closely approach or attempt to intercept the targets and then damage them in some ways from collision, or maybe they have a weapon on board. So our solution to protect these nuclear command and control satellites is for the US, Russia, and China to mutually agree not to maneuver their own satellites within these orbits within 700 kilometers of each other's satellites. This forms what are typically referred to as keep-out zones around each satellite. So this would do a couple of things. First, it would provide warning of an attack. So because satellites would have to start from a minimum distance away or a co-orbital weapon would have to start from a minimum distance away from its target, it would provide the defender with the opportunity to detect an incoming attack with their space situational awareness capabilities and respond to that in some way. And secondly, it prevents routine repositioning of satellites from being misinterpreted as an attack. So if Russia happened to be moving one of its satellites and it passes closely by a United States satellite, the US might interpret that as an attack because they see a satellite coming close. So this would avoid that by requiring sort of a priori or a prior warning of any sort of movements through another satellite's keep-out zones, and by only doing those repositionings sort of once at a time, one satellite at a time. And so for this, we chose a keep-out zone of 700 kilometers, which is about 1 degree of true anomaly. And so this is sort of large enough that it provides an appreciable amount of warning while small enough to limit the disruption to day-to-day activities in those orbits. And so that's the one that we came up with, but the participants would be free to choose a different size to sort of balance their concerns of those two things. And secondly, I want to turn to the prohibition of the testing and deployment of space-based missile defenses. So missile defenses in general can undermine a state's confidence in their ability to maintain a survivable second strike capability that they can use to respond to a nuclear attack on their own soil. Space-based defenses in particular circumvent some of the weaknesses that challenge current mid-course defenses, such as countermeasures. But though they might get around those countermeasures, they require huge numbers of satellite interceptors to be placed into orbit, probably hundreds of satellites, each carrying multiple interceptors, in order to get the coverage you would need to respond to launches around the globe. So the huge cost of pursuing such a project, as well as some other remaining weaknesses in the technology, means that the United States is really unlikely to pursue such a capability, a space-based missile defense network. But that doesn't stop Russia and China from worrying that these defenses might become feasible or might be deployed in the future. And as James mentioned, they have been spending a lot of effort investing in these exotic delivery systems that can circumvent ballistic missile defenses in general, including space-based missile defenses. And those delivery systems have raised other concerns. So our proposal is for the United States, Russia, and China to agree not to test space-based defenses or deploy such capabilities. So if you want to gain a meaningful and reliable operational capability with a space-based missile defense system, a state would need to conduct a really lengthy testing campaign and deploy hundreds of satellites carrying interceptors. So without testing, no system will be reliable, and without deployment, you don't have a system. So really, you need to do both of these things in order to get a useful system. So we think that using existing space situational awareness capabilities, the states would be able to sort of meaningfully verify the absence of both testing and deployment of these, meaning that Russia and China can really sort of gain confidence that the U.S. will not deploy such systems in the future, undermining their nuclear deterrent, hopefully lessening some of the incentives on them to deploy these sort of exotic delivery systems. So I believe we'll turn it back to Anya now to ask some questions.
Sorry, I was just going to come back and just discuss one of our other measures. Thanks, TD. As I discussed before, there's a series of long-term and short-term measures. And I just wanted to kind of flag up one of the other measures that we're proposing as being a very ambitious long-term measure. But I think the kind of measure that it's helpful for states to articulate and identify as a long-term goal, to try to get traction about a vision for arms control as a tool to really enhance stability in a long-term durable way. With the collapse of the INF Treaty, the US and Russia are now competing quite vigorously in medium and intermediate range missiles. But for the time being, at least, their strategic forces are capped by New START. The US and China are kind of competing across the spectrum here because they have no limitations on their forces. Now, from a US perspective, what the US kind of in the abstract would love to do would be a trilateral style INF treaty that didn't, that captured Russia systems, including the 9M729 that led to the breakup of the INF treaty, but also captured China's weapons in that category. That's approach not acceptable to China because China has many more in regional theater weapons than the United States does. China would probably quite like the idea. So then, in terms of the in terms of intercontinental, in terms of strategic forces, because the United States and Russia have a much larger arsenal than China. They would be happy with an agreement on strategic forces that cap China's arsenal at its current much smaller level than theirs, but that approach would obviously be unacceptable to China. And so my colleague Tong Zhao came up with this idea of why not essentially merge those two treaties together and focus on launchers, which are much easier to verify than missiles. So essentially one could have a limit on missile launchers, on land and submarine launched ballistic missile launchers and heavy bombers, of all the categories that were covered by the INF Treaty and New START together. Because as it happens, if you look at it, Russia, China, and the US have broadly equal numbers of systems in that category. And there are reasons to suppose that that rough symmetry may continue going forward. So that was another idea that we investigated. Now, we think it's not quite possible to combine New START and INF treaties definitions, and there's lots of analysis as to exactly how to modify these definitions. But the big idea here, kind of as a admittedly challenging long-term goal, but is to try to limit the US, Russian, and Chinese launchers and bombers of roughly the types that were constrained under INF and are constrained under New START today. So let me end there and hand back over to Anya.
Thank you so much for your remarks, James and TD. Let me kick off the conversation with a couple of questions for you. And to our audience, please ask your questions in the YouTube chat that you see to the right of the screen, and we'll turn to them in short order. So let me start with a broad question to both of you. This report builds on another report that you released a year ago with 5 of these 9 proposals. Since then, you've had the additional opportunity to road test those ideas, receive some feedback. There have also been many real-world developments and revelations about capabilities that I know have, in the United States, influenced the nuclear posture review debate, for example. What have you learned, and how has that translated into this version of the report? And what are the things that perhaps surprised you the most in the feedback that you've received?
Maybe I'll kick off on that one. I'd highlight 2 developments over the past year. Our approach for trying to manage China's nuclear arsenal, which we explained a year ago, is basically to say that at the moment, China doesn't have enough fissile material to build up its nuclear forces to anywhere close to the level of the United States. And so if you want to prevent a US-Chinese nuclear arms race from intensifying, you actually don't have to cap China's nuclear forces per se, if you could get it to agree to cap its fissile material production, which is going to require very significant concessions by the United States. Now, when we published this idea a year ago, the intelligence community had much smaller projections for how it expected China's nuclear arsenal to grow. We didn't know about the silo building, for example. And one of the real-world developments that I think has underscored the importance of trying to focus on fissile material between the United States and China, but it also made it harder to do, are all of the revelations about the speed with which China's nuclear arsenal is expanding. Now, I would be surprised if the IC's expectation of 1,000 warheads by 2030 or so was actually met. But I think there's not much doubt in my mind that China is going to expand its nuclear arsenal significantly. The other area that I would highlight is one of our other space-related proposals is for the US, China, and Russia to notify one another of a trilateral scheme for notification of missile launches and space launches. And it occurred to us that the proposal that we outlined a year ago was probably a bit too limited in scope. So we expanded it a bit to also include things like suborbital space launches, which as we define it would include anti-satellite weapons. We came up with this idea before Russia's recent test. But I think actually Russia's recent test has underscored the value of trying to have a broader range of space activities declared as possible. So those are some of the big changes and developments that have occupied us over the last year or so.
Sure. I'll jump in on a sort of a more one specific proposal that from the first interim report on inspecting empty warhead storage facilities in order to basically determine and ensure that there are no nuclear weapons stored in what used to be or was a cleared out or emptied storage facility. Some of the feedback we got from experts, including at DITRA, were very enlightening as to some of the things you really don't think about when you look at it from the physics perspective of the difficulty of handling nuclear weapons and the sort of the level of things like climate control, air conditioning in storage facilities that really are necessary to keep these weapons usable. So if you can show that those aren't in a building, perhaps then that it's very unlikely that there would be nuclear weapons stored there, just because the people who are in charge of storing or handling nuclear weapons, 12 Gumo in Russia, really would not be willing to take some of the risks that we, looking at physics, might look at. So when we were looking at our verification schemes, we were thinking, okay, what happens if they store a nuclear weapon in a car to avoid inspectors? And from talking to the experts who've worked with the Russians, the immediate response was they would never do anything remotely that risky because they would not want to be on the hook for something going wrong. So it really opened my eyes to some of the more practical measures. And in terms of, the real world things that have gone on since then, our proposal is to basically start doing these things almost like an experiment between the US and Russia so that they can start building up this capability. Towards the end of the Trump administration, when they were trying to work with something with Russia, they proposed a warhead freeze as a way to get around this warhead counting thing that we're proposing we should work on. It really highlighted how difficult and far away we are on these things. We really need to start working on them now in order to build up the capability that we can have the ability to do in the future. Those are the two things.
Great. So as our audience may have seen, James and TD recently authored an op-ed on the importance of protecting nuclear command and control satellites that dovetails the proposal outlined in the report and also discussed by TD today. How do you see this idea, as well as the proposal on space-based missile defenses, interacting with the somewhat entrenched positions on space security issues in existing international fora? And what do you think can catalyze a breakthrough?
I'm happy to jump in first on this, James. Yeah, so space really has not been a fertile ground for cooperative agreements in the past, in part because Russia and China viewed this US's heavy reliance on space as sort of an avenue where they might be able to regain some advantage in a conflict, especially in a conventional conflict. However, I think there is some sort of headway that can be gained by focusing really at the intersection of nuclear and space, because all three of those parties really have a vested interest in not having a nuclear war. So if you really focus on this split between nuclear and conventional, and really focus on the nuclear part, you sort of gain the leverage of the nuclear side as a rationale for why you might accept these limitations that you might not want to take on a broad spectrum. So the US and Russia might not, Russia and China might really not be interested in limitations on anti-satellite weapons broadly, but narrowly focusing on protecting ones in high altitude orbits that are nuclear related. Well, all satellites in protecting. Our proposal will just protect all satellites in high altitude orbits, but those are mostly heavily populated with nuclear satellites. That might be a trade-off they'd be willing to make. So a nice like fire break where they can make some headway.
Yeah, I mean, let me build on that briefly. I think that's exactly right. And my impression is a lot of the discourse around space security focuses on generic behavior that could apply to every orbit, low Earth orbit or geostationary or MONIA or whatever. But states' incentives to cooperate are different depending on the orbital regime that you're in. As TD said, these very high altitude orbits that are made use of by critical nuclear command and control satellites, they're both more difficult to attack and the consequences of attack are much greater. So it seems to me possible that the US, Russia, and China perhaps could identify opportunities for cooperation in these very specific orbital regimes that they don't necessarily see it, for example, in low Earth orbit, which is by far the most heavily inhabited orbit.
So in several chapters of the report, you discuss potential options to deal with concerns regarding non-strategic nuclear weapons in the European theater. And you propose a transparency regime and central limits that could potentially provide transparency and limit many, if not all, US Russian warheads. Can you please talk about how you see these two proposals potentially playing in the ongoing US Russian strategic stability dialogue? And separately also, do you see a role for the UK and France here, since that's another element of Russia's negotiations posture on this issue?
Sure. So in terms of non-strategic nuclear weapons, we've got two different proposals there. There's a short-term proposal, or a near-term proposal, I think is a better term, to verify the absence of nuclear warheads at sites at which they're not stored but could be. And then there's a much longer-term proposal, which is kind of like, I think a lot of Americans, including myself for that matter, kind of view like the holy grail of arms control, being a limit on all warheads. That is an extremely difficult long-term goal. It's the one proposal we analyze in the report that we don't think could be negotiated, even if politics was very conducive. We don't think this could be advocated in the short term. And we think this is not an issue that it's really productive for the US to push right now to be trying to limit all warheads. If you want to move in that direction, there's a whole research and cooperation agenda which, I think starting with verifying the absence of nuclear warheads is a good place to begin. But the one area in which we really do sound a note of caution here is not to try to push for a very, very challenging agreement to verify the absence of all warheads. And I'm sorry, Anya, what was the second part of the question?
Well, so the second part of the question is, like, how do you see this playing into the ongoing political process with a strategic stability dialogue? That's one element of it. And two, there's potentially, as the Russians have claimed, a role for the UK and France here, right? Because they have to consider all warheads as, as part of that threat. So there's sort of two elements here: the ongoing politics and then sort of the Russian position on SNW.
So, I mean, in terms of the politics of that, I think the Russians have made it very clear they don't want a single limit on all warheads with verification. And I think if the US can identify more modest interim goals, that may make Russia somewhat more willing to engage on non-strategic nuclear weapons. There have been, Russia's position for a long time has been, we won't even discuss non-strategic nuclear weapons until all US such weapons have been withdrawn from Europe. There's some, I think Russia is aware that it's going to have to at least be willing to take baby steps on this issue. And we hope that our idea of verifying the absence of warheads is a good first step there. In terms of the UK and France, this is not an issue that we address in the report, but I think a good way forward here with the UK and France, and potentially China as well, would be for them on a voluntary basis to start making the kind of declarations that Russia and the United States do under New START. One could at least start to imagine cooperative, non-binding transparency proposals involving potentially all of the P5. That's something I've written about before. It's not something that I focused on in this report specifically. But that's one opportunity there.
Several proposals in the report also tackle concerns around intermediate range systems and regional missile defenses and propose solutions in the bilateral or trilateral format, as I think you've mentioned already today. Can you talk about some of the challenges of negotiating this in the context of US allied relationships in European and Pacific theaters? I think that's the one question that always comes up with allies. It's like, especially if the US is seeking to reduce its role, its reliance on nuclear weapons. What are the ways that the US can reassure allies with regard to these things?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great question. I think it's more helpful to look at the kind of specifics of these proposals rather than in the abstract. I mean, one of our ideas here is, Russia's expressed concerns about the Aegis Ashore missile defenses in Poland and Romania. And we call for a confidence building regime so Russia could verify that these missile defenses can't catch Russian ICBMs and aren't loaded with offensive missiles, which is a concern that Russia has expressed. And that potentially could involve inspections on allied territory. So I think, the first thing to recognize is that allies' views about this is not homogeneous. There are allies who are strongly supportive of arms control, and there are allies who are concerned about it. I think, on the one hand, allies don't want to make big concessions to Russia, especially the ones closer to Russia. On the other hand, they also don't want there to be escalation in which their territory could be targeted. So we're trying to thread all of these different needles in terms of our proposals. Very similar considerations at this very high level apply, I think, to the Asia Pacific as well. What I would say is I think it's very important that the US develops these proposals in cooperation with allies. We have clear precedent for Russian inspections on allied territory. Under the INF Treaty, Russia the Soviet Union initially conducted inspections. I think it was in 5 NATO allies of the United States. So there is a clear kind of precedent for that happening there. Ultimately, I believe that the proposals that we're outlining enhance allied security. I think, I'd be honest, I think we have had a range of different feedback from allies. Some who are more in favor of certain proposals, some who like others, and some who are more skeptical of the whole idea. But I think when you point out the history and the precedent that does exist here for inspections on Allied territory, and you point out the potential advantages, and if this is definitely handled by the US in terms of developing these ideas cooperatively with allies and not surprising allies and working through them with allies before it goes to Russia with the proposals, at least that directly concern allies, I think the politics of alliances here is manageable.
I have another question on allies to build on that. So broadly, with regard to all of these proposals, do you see a role for allies in the context of verification, for example, or research on verification modalities?
Yeah, TT, do you want to come in here, or do you want me to handle?
I'll touch briefly, and then I can hand it off to you. So one of the, so as James mentioned, a couple of the proposals do involve facilities that might be in NATO, in non-US NATO countries. So presumably the allies would need to be involved some way, if there's a mock inspection, for example, going on in their territories. This is especially in terms of the Warhead storage facility piece, but also the ballistic missile system, or ballistic missile defense ground-based transparency regime James mentioned. Some of the sort of technical stuff that needs to be done in terms of the warhead counting or warhead verification things, well, ultimately that will need to be sort of worked out in detail lab to lab between the US and Russia, say. There's a lot of research that can go on in the broader academic space that can help out developing the technologies we might be useful for verifying things without leaking information. So what jumps to mind for me is the sort of zero knowledge or physical cryptography kind of verification of warheads. So proving that a warhead is a warhead without leaking any information about it. A lot of that work goes on in sort of the open academic source, and that would be useful for any sort of warhead freeze or warhead counting kind of arrangement. So there is certainly, on the scientific side, a lot of room for collaboration from non-US, Russia, China entities.
Yeah, and I'd just point out briefly, there are, allies have been involved in two, at least off the top of my head, two inspection regimes. One was the INF Treaty, but there was also the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, in which, there are a number of allies with quite significant experience of how to conduct on-the-ground inspections. So, I think it's not something we focus particularly on in the report, but I think as TT has outlined, a lot of various different proposals, the verification would have to be, on Allied territory, would have to be implemented jointly by the United States and whichever ally was being inspected. And so, I think there will be a lot of scope for allies there to cooperate in the development of a verification regime.
And I'm going to ask my last question before we transition to Q&A from the audience. James, you mentioned the negotiation of win-win packages as part of as part of these negotiations. What do you see as the potential catalyst for these negotiations, given the current security situation and sort of the bilateral relations between the US and Russia and the US and China? Does something like this require a high-level summit of the three leaders, perhaps a process like the Nuclear Security Summit? What do you think is sort of the successful way to push this issue forward?
I'm tempted to remark that a very dangerous crisis that's averted is kind of what we need right now to kick off arms control. But one hopes that you can get to arms control without having that crisis first. I think pivotal to progress is leadership level engagement at the most general level. I mean, none of the three presidents of the countries are going to start negotiating arms control details personally. I mean, we tried that in the last administration and I don't think it went so well. But, having leaders set and identify clear goals, I think, is very valuable. So Putin and Biden kicked off the strategic stability talks at their summit. And I think that it would be very helpful if an early output from those talks was a joint statement by the two presidents, identifying in very general terms concrete measures that they wanted their negotiators to try to reach. And this is something that quite often happens in arms control. You know, the presidents agree on very high level goals and then tell the negotiators to go away and try to turn them into reality. I think that would be helpful. I think in a similar way, I mean, there's lots of potential challenges to engaging China. And it's hard to be particularly sanguine there right now. But I do think that, you know, we had hints after the most recent virtual summit between Biden and Xi that the two leaders had agreed or were in the process or may be able to reach an agreement on direct talks between the two countries. The other aspect to all of this is I think it becomes much more likely if arms control progress becomes much more likely if each of the three states simultaneously believe their security will be enhanced by it. And this is actually a challenge for the US that wants to engage China, because we really have to grapple with the question, what are we going to give up in return for engaging China? You know, in a fair world, we would think about what we wanted from the Chinese, and the Chinese would think about what they wanted from us. And then we could trade off. In the real world, we're the ones that want to engage China. China doesn't particularly want to engage us right now on arms control. But I think it becomes much more likely if in addition to identifying clear concessions we want from the Chinese, we can identify clear things we're willing to give up to China to create these mutually beneficial packages. And that's something that I think for all the entreaties from the US government to the Chinese government to engage in this, it hasn't yet indicated, even in the most general terms, what it's willing to give up. You know, over the long run, something like a prohibition on testing or deploying space-based missile defenses seems to us to be the kind of thing that would be a big deal from the Russian and Chinese perspective that could be a real potential lever for engaging them in arms control.
All right, so let's transition to some of the audience questions we have coming in. So Marina Robinson Snowden asks, how do you see China's silo buildup potentially affecting their pushback against joining strategic stability talks or future strategic arms control negotiations?
Sure. Thanks so much for the question, Marina. My hope has always been that as China feels more confident in the survivability of its nuclear forces, it will become more willing to engage with the United States on arms control. You know, one of the concerns we've long heard from Chinese experts about engaging in arms control is that the kind of transparency that arms control involves could undermine the survivability of China's forces. As China becomes more confident in the survivability of those forces, both against preemptive attack by the United States and against ballistic missile defenses, I think the silos are at some level to do with both of those. China, I've always hoped, will become more willing to engage. Now, there's a countervailing trend there, which is that US-China political relations are becoming worse. But I don't, you know, as much as I think that China's build-up is, and in particular, the change in thinking that build-up represents, and I'm particularly worried here by China about China's regional forces as opposed to its strategic forces. As much as I think this build-up indicates a potentially worrying line of thinking in Chinese nuclear doctrine, I actually don't think it necessarily decreases the likelihood of arms control. It may not increase it by very much, but I don't think it decreases it by all that much. And I am by no means optimistic, but I'd like to think that if you could get top-level engagement on these issues, if the US is willing to identify reasonable concessions that it can give up in return for Chinese concessions, there is potentially some scope to engage here on arms control.
I'll just briefly comment on sort of a practical issue that this may raise, is that basically now that there are hundreds of new silos, there are now hundreds of new sites that are going to need to be, or may need to be inspected in the future, depending on what kind of arms control agreements that they get into. So it may sort of down the road also create a bit of a thorn in China's side, where now they have a large number of sites that they're going to need to be more open than they might care to be at, in order to be able to really engage with any verification regime that's going to involve counting launchers or silos missiles.
So related to this current discussion we're having on China right now, Justin Anderson asks, if the US and China strategic stability talks commence, what issues would you suggest this possible prelude to future arms control negotiation address?
TD, do you want to kick this off, or shall I?
I'll leave this one to you for a second.
Okay. Again, thanks so much for the question, Justin. I think there are various different areas. I mean, one which we don't really address in this report, but is doctrine. China has various different nuclear developments underway. And I put these in two buckets. One is developments in modernization of China's long-range forces capable of reaching the United States. I believe these are to do with essentially a defensive move to ensure the survivability of China's nuclear arsenal. There are plenty of people who disagree with me. Then there are improvements in China's regional forces, which I believe do signify a real and kind of worrying change in Chinese doctrine, because I think they're about providing China with limited options in a nuclear war. I think it would be very helpful for the US to put these concerns to China and for China to explain them. China will have concerns likewise about US modernization and doctrine and program. So, I do think that there is, even before you get to arms control, there's value here in terms of just discussing doctrine and trying to explain your doctrine to one another. In terms of the preludes to arms control, I mean, one I think is pivotally important is fissile material, which has never been a major focus of arms control with the Russian. I mean, with Russia, we have various agreements that involve fissile material with Russia, but it's never been like an arms control focus with Russia. But I do think, talking about Chinese fissile material production as a way of China being able to demonstrate that, as it says, it does not seek an arms race with the United States, I think is very important. I think we would want to be willing to clearly the US has concerns about China's strategic and non-strategic and regional forces that we want to put on the table, and we have to be willing, I think, in return to be dealing with all of the issues that China puts on the table. I mean, it's going to put ballistic missile defenses on the table. It's going to put high precision conventional weapons and hypersonics and this, that, and the other. And I think, basically all of the sides have to be willing to not veto any areas from discussion. Now, the critical thing here is each side is going to have to show restraint, I think. And I would limit strategic stability talks to capabilities that directly interact with nuclear weapons. So China is furious about AUKUS. Like, I don't like AUKUS, but China is furious about AUKUS. If China honestly believes that Australia having submarines give it conventional strike capabilities that it could undermine China's nuclear deterrent, and I don't believe China thinks that, but if China really honestly thinks that, AUKUS is a legitimate issue for discussion. But I don't believe China does that, and China would have to show restraint and not try to put AUKUS on the table. Conversely, the US there's a whole bunch of Chinese cyber operations that are deeply disquieting to the US, but that, stealing fighter jet plans, personnel information. But again, those don't interact with nuclear weapons. So I think each side would have to show restraint and would have to limit the focus of discussion to nuclear capabilities or capabilities that directly could directly interact with nuclear capabilities.
And we have another question from Justin. So TD's comments on empty warhead storage facilities proposals suggest that this could be a confidence building measure and a building block for future verification. How does this apply to a more comprehensive future verification regime?
Yeah, that's a great question, and really one of the sort of driving forces why we came up with the idea as we did is that it might be a good stepping stone towards a larger agreement. So basically, the sort of longer range idea is that if the US and Russia ever get to a point where they want to place a limit on all warheads, including those in storage or non-strategic warheads, they're going to need to be able to essentially count warheads. Basically, we've taken the easy way out up at this point and only really limited launchers, which we can verify with satellites and planes. But once you get down to a warhead, which may be, order of a meter large, you kind of need to get there in person and count them. So if the agreement, say, limited the US and Russia to 2,000, any number of warheads, they would then need to declare how many warheads that they had at X different facilities, and the total needs to be less than the limit. And to verify that that's true, the other, if say the US declares we have 400 warheads at this facility, Russia would need to send their inspectors to come and make sure there are not 401. There are not any more than that. So the way those sort of inspections would work is that the sort of 400 objects declared to be warheads, you can kind of just leave those alone because there's no benefit to be gained from saying this empty container is a warhead. It just counts against your limit. But then the inspectors need to verify is that there aren't real warheads sort of hidden around the facility. So the way they would have to do this is basically going around and looking, either using radiation detection equipment, if possible, to make sure there's no radioactive signatures, and make sure that there just aren't warheads in hiding. And that process is basically the exact same process you would do on an empty storage facility. You're walking around making sure there are no warheads where they're not supposed to be. The advantage of doing it at an empty facility is that there are no warheads there, so it's a lot less sensitive. It's a sort of a lower temperature way to get at it, and it sort of provides a good ground for developing the procedures that would be mutually acceptable to both sides for how to deal with other sensitive things that might be at a facility, say the security systems or whatnot, that there are going to be hurdles that needs to be ironed out. They should be solvable, but they will take some effort and some experience to work through. So that's why we proposed working on sort of a small number of mutually agreed locations early on and start building up this muscle memory for how you do these inspections that might be applied later on to actually counting or making sure that there are no extra warheads at facilities where warheads are actually present.
And I have a follow-up to that question. So we've been living with this reality of the COVID pandemic for quite some time now, for a couple of years. And as you know, the pandemic has also affected the inspections as part of the New START verification regime. So when you think about these more intrusive inspections that involve facilities and kind of inspections on shorter time frame, how do you think about it in the context of potential pandemics or sort of some of these things that we'll clearly have to be living with and be resilient with for the duration?
That's an interesting question. To be honest, in my opinion, it would just have to be a matter of priority. There are sports events going on right now. I would assume that they would have to work out an agreement to make these things feasible, even in a situation where there might be travel restrictions, difficulties getting visas, et cetera. So it would take some extra effort on the political side, but I'm not sure if sort of the reason why we propose these sort of inspections is kind of because we haven't figured out a better way to not have to do them. There may be certain things you could do with remote sensors like at an area, but say Russia is going to be very hesitant to allow a US security camera in one of their storage facilities, for example. So I think the sort of upside of a in-person inspection is that it's very contained in time. So it doesn't disrupt the basin long term. And so I think that preference would probably win out in long term, and they would have to sort of deal with the other issues that creates rather than accept that the pandemic might affect the inspections.
Great. So we have another question from Marina Robinson Snowden. would the United States pursuing a space-based missile tracking satellite constellation intersect with your idea of a prohibition on space-based missile defenses?
I'm happy to jump in on this one also. So in our proposal, we specifically, we were aware that, when we talk about space-based missile defenses, the sensors are part of the defense, but we really limited our proposal to limiting the weapons. So either kinetic interceptors or directed energy weapons, or anything that actually directly damages or interferes with the ballistic missile. And so no small part because sort of sensors in space are not going to go away. They're too useful for too many things, and countries are too reliant upon them to really accept giving them up or placing limits on them. So we wanted to make sure our proposal was crafted to sort of respect that. In terms of, could a ballistic missile tracking satellite constellation affect the sort of feasibility of, or the sort of the utility of our test ban? I don't think so, because even if you have a very robust set of sensors, you're still going to need to do the kinetic tests or your actual interceptor test to make sure that your interceptors are reliable. And in terms of might a sort of a dense constellation of remote sensing satellites sort of start looking like a missile defense capability, I don't think that would be the case, just because the sheer number of missile defense satellites you would need. So I think they would be sufficiently distinguishable that they're not going to cause issues in that respect. And I still think the hurdle of the requirement for actual testing will really impinge on the ability to sneak out or clandestinely develop a missile defense capability, regardless of what the sensor environment looks like.
Excellent. So one of the aspects of the report that I personally found interesting was a discussion of modalities of all these proposals. And sort of in the space of nuclear arms control that I tend to be most comfortable with, it's perhaps a very trite observation that the Russians want a legally binding agreement, while the United States can potentially find ratification a challenging process. So thus would prefer something that's a little more, has less hurdles domestically. But I think in the report, since you look over a much broader swath of capabilities and territory in strategic sense, there's a couple of places where you note that the US would potentially prefer legally binding agreements where Russia and China would not. I think it also depends if we're talking about nearer term agreements versus longer term agreements. Can you please talk about this issue of modalities and how you approached it in this report?
Sure, and it's one of these issues that the US and Russia, the difference between their stated positions is not quite as big as the difference between their real position, between how they act and what they say is different. So they actually are more similar in how they act than what they say. Russia's position, as you say, for a long time has been, these strategic capabilities are of supreme importance and we have to deal with them with legally binding agreements. In practice, Russia has not always stuck by that. I mean, you can think of, for example, the Sea Launch Cruise Missile Transparency Declarations that accompanied START 1 but were not part of that treaty. You can think of the Ballistic Missile Launch Notification Regime, which was, before it was incorporated into treaties, was non-legally binding. The Joint Verification Experiment was a non-legally binding agreement to measure the yield of one another's nuclear tests. And the US, on the other hand, has said, has long said we're really interested in doing non-binding stuff and transparency. But in practice has often been unwilling to negotiate the details of any of this because, there's been resistance to talking about ballistic missile defenses at all. I mean, the US has at times engaged on the details and at times not. But I did take it as a positive step. I've taken Ryabkov's comments as a positive step. That Russia is interested in doing both legally binding and non-binding together. And as a practical matter, I just think that's what you have to do. It is hard for me to imagine a willingness really on either side to try to manage strategic nuclear forces in a non-binding way. And I think even if you can't get Senate ratification, there are advantages to having negotiated a treaty. I mean, I think of SALT II here. where the Carter administration negotiated SALT II. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. SALT II was, I can't remember, I think it was withdrawn from consideration in the Senate. But both sides agreed to stick by that agreement for a prolonged period of time, even though it was not binding. Now, look, it's clearly better to ratify treaties than not ratify them, and it's also better having ratified them not to withdraw from them. I do think that there is value to pursuing legally binding arrangements, even if you're worried you can't get it ratified, because it sets a norm for behavior. But there's also stuff that, frankly, both sides are going to find amazingly difficult to deal with in treaties. I mean, with Russian developments in their ballistic missile defenses, it's not clear to me whether Russia really wants a treaty that starts to capture large parts of ballistic missile defenses. So, I wouldn't necessarily have a big theory about what should be binding and what should be non-binding. It's kind of a case-by-case basis about what I think is actually about what we think is useful and possible.
Excellent. So there's another follow-up question on verification, and this one is, having spent numerous hours reading about Putin's personal attitudes towards perimeter portal monitoring and on-site inspections, this question is makes me warm and fuzzy. What are your thoughts on how portal monitoring, in addition to on-site inspections, could play a role in future verification regime that includes non-strategic nuclear weapons?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I won't comment on the political aspect, but on the technical aspect, I think there's definitely a place for it, especially in, and forgive me if you can hear my 3-month-old in the background. He's very enthusiastic about arms control. So in terms of an agreement that places limits on numbers of warheads or places a freeze, which was the Trump administration's way of getting around having to count, you need some form of ability to basically monitor the warheads that go in and out of storage to refurbishment or to be remade. Because the Russian warheads in particular, I believe, are refurbished quite regularly, more regular than the United States ones. But you need a way to make sure that one warhead doesn't go in and 2 come out, but it all gets counted as one. So you need to make sure you're monitoring that area. So portal monitoring would be an interesting sort of necessity for a freeze, which would be a sort of a stepping stone to the larger agreement. Might also be necessary in just a broader agreement to make sure that there are no sort of clandestinely produced warheads that are just being made out of stockpile material, essentially, and shipped off to clandestine storage facilities. So I think definitely there's a role to be played for portal monitoring. There might be some interesting technical questions in terms of making sure that something is a warhead without releasing information about the warhead that still need to be resolved. But I know, as I mentioned earlier, there's some academic groups working on that. So hopefully it'll be a useful tool in the future.
I think we have a great question here on kind of continuing this discussion of kind of the broader modalities and kind of how you go about the political process. Do all of your proposals assume like-for-like trades? And if so, how do you view the discussion about asymmetric arms control in terms of reductions, ceilings, and domains?
I think we have a few proposals that ought to be win-win-win by themselves. Like, I just think the idea of a trilateral launch notification regime between the US, Russia, and China is just like a let's avoid really dangerous stuff that could get us into a nuclear war. I'm not sure all countries do see a common interest in that, but I think they really ought to see a common interest in that kind of proposal. Other proposals, such as the confidence building measures for Aegis Ashore, such as inspections of empty warhead storage facilities to verify they're empty, those are going to have trade-offs to have any chance of getting them off the ground. I think the feasibility of asymmetric arms control, which is an idea that my friend Heather Williams, as many of you may know, has written about this at some length. I think you can imagine arms control agreements that are tactically asymmetric. I mean, something like SALT I actually constrained US and Soviet limits different. They actually were subject to different limits under the treaty. I think that is a very hard thing to do politically. You know, I think in the 1970s, when the Senate was more willing to defer to the judgment of the president in ratifying treaties, you could get that kind of thing through the Senate. Although actually SALT I was an executive agreement that required a vote of both houses, but like, let's not get, the principle applies even if the ratification mechanism was different. I think today negotiating something that had asymmetric limits for the US and Russia would be very, very difficult. I think both politically difficult for both countries to accept. I think actually though, what we are proposing here is something that is strategically asymmetric. That is to say that, you know, the BMD proposal, even if the provisions are entirely reciprocal, is more beneficial to Russia. And that's why you have to pair it with something like a non-strategic nuclear weapons measure, which even though the provisions are entirely reciprocal, is more advantageous to the US. So in that sense, I think what we're trying to do here, I think all arms control these days is asymmetric in some sense because of the asymmetries in Russian and Chinese and US interests.
That is an excellent question for us to close out on. So thank you so much to the audience for joining us. And once again, the new report from the Nuclear Policy Program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace is titled Reimagining Nuclear Arms Control, a Comprehensive Approach. It's available on their website. Please check it out. Thank you.